without any further ado, I want to get started because time is of the essence, and introduce the panel to you briefly, and then they can say a few things themselves about who they are and what they do. So to my immediate left, Alicka Ampry-Samuel is the new regional administrator for what's widely known as, and HUD's best region, the one that has New York in it. Region 2, number 2, but it's going to be number 1 someday. Then Diane Yantel, dear friend of the network. We've been working closely as they're one of our big-time national partners on issues around housing and homelessness, affordable housing. We've been active in the Housed campaign, which all of you should know, and I'm sure Diane will say a little bit more about. But Diane is the Chief Executive Officer with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. And to the far left, in more ways than one, possibly to my far left,
I'll take it.
is Jeff Olivet. Jeff is also the fairly newish director of the U.S. ICH, Interagency Council on Homelessness. Again, really important player at the federal level. So without any further ado, as people continue to file in and take a seat in the front row, Nicole, right up here. Alicka, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your role, how you came to HUD, and what you've been doing prior to it?
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. This is a very impressive room. So my name is Alicka Ampry-Samuel, and I serve as the regional administrator at HUD for the state of New York and New Jersey. I am 5 months into the job, and so it's pretty exciting. But prior to this role, I served in the New York City Council, and I represented the 41st Council District in Brooklyn, and had the pleasure of representing the highest concentration of public housing in North America. And it was a pleasure and a treat because I actually grew up in public housing. I grew up in NYCHA. And I also chaired the Public Housing Committee. And prior to that, I worked at NYCHA. And while working at NYCHA, I said, I'm going to run for office. This is crazy. But and all joking aside, I have about 25 years of experience in the housing field. My first job out of college was working on the street team at Goddard Riverside. I was part of an ACT team. And so, and at one point in my life, I worked at Common Ground. And at one point in my life, I represented the State Department and served at the embassy in Ghana for 3 years. And it was just interesting. I'm a close here, but I found it very ironic that I was in another country, in a developing country, explaining why American dollars had to be spent overseas to assist their citizens in finding decent and affordable housing, knowing that our families in public housing and our individuals on the street was going through it. So I was glad to come back home, and I'm glad to be in this dream job.
And Diane, tell us a little bit about what's going on with you and your past experience in foreign countries.
Sure. Hi, I'm Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We're a membership organization. Our work is all about advancing racially and socially just public policy that ensures that the lowest income people have decent, accessible, affordable homes in communities of their choice. I've been in this role at the coalition for about 6 years. I previously, back in 2005, I was a policy analyst at NLIHC. I've also worked at Enterprise Community Partners to head up their public policy team. I was at HUD, where I led the Public Housing Management and Occupancy Division in Washington, D.C., and I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia for about 3.5 years. So that's my overseas experience.
Not sure if I'm supposed to start with my leftist politics or my street outreach work or my time working in Africa. I think maybe I'll start with the work in Africa, since that's the common theme here. I was working many years ago in East Africa in Nairobi with people experiencing homelessness, and I didn't know it at the time. It was refugees and asylum seekers from the wars in Rwanda and Burundi in the early 90s, the genocide there. And I came back to the States and started volunteering at a homeless shelter, a day center in Boston called St. Francis House, and this is where I need to be. The domestic work was calling me. The outrageousness of homelessness in this nation, in this incredibly wealthy nation, is so deeply offensive on so many levels. I felt like we got to do something about this, and we got to do something about it fast. That was 1994. I'm now 28 years into this work. I see some other folks here who maybe they've got some water under the bridge too. I was a street outreach worker with the Healthcare for the Homeless Project in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I ran housing programs, did a lot of local coalition building work, and then moved into national policy and research work. A lot of my career for the last decade or more has really been focused on the intersection of racial inequity and homelessness. It has felt for far too long that we know the reality that people of color are dramatically overrepresented in the homeless population. Maybe that gets named every now and then, but our systems and our programs aren't doing much about it. They're not designed to address racial injustice, and in fact, they're designed to create racial injustice. So a lot of what I bring to my job is a deep commitment to ending homelessness, but also a deep commitment to advancing racial equity. I've been in this job 3.5 months. I was tapped by the Biden-Harris administration at the 1st of February, and I'm now running the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, which is a very small but mighty team within the federal government dedicated to the task of ending homelessness in the United States with all of the muscle we can muster in the federal government. We've got 19 agency partners. We work very closely with HUD, with the White House, with VA, HHS, education, labor, all down the line, trying to point administration policy and efforts in the same direction.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And again, it's a couple seats in the front where you can get a beautiful view of me. So come on down if you wish. Actually, anybody that has an extra seat, maybe if you're right next to you, raise your hand. Look at all those extra seats. Come on down. Great. So I also wanted to mention Alicka, unfortunately, has a commitment to run to New Jersey. So she's going to be leaving early. Just for that, that's the virtues, I think, of being a regional administrator. So you've got to be in 2 places at the same time, but we're glad you're here now. I think maybe, can I throw the first question to you?
Sure.
So tell us what, what do you expect for the next couple of years at least in your role as regional administrator, and what kinds of initiatives do you intend to pursue, particularly in New York State?
So because I know I only have 2 years, right? That gives me the opportunity to do a whole bunch of stuff, right? But at the same time, understanding that we're not able to change so much in such little time, and so being able to focus on just a couple of things. But also knowing that with HUD, everything that we're seeing today coming out of the administration, all of the dollars, all of the resources and tools that we see right now, we know is coming like on the back of COVID and people just protesting and demanding change. And so the resources that we see today, we will not see after this at all. And so it is my goal to make sure that on the community level, the folks and organizations that are doing the work are able to tap into those resources now. And so it's my job to make sure that I am that face of HUD, but on a ground, on a local level. And one other thing I want to say, Secretary Fudge, when asked, who's our customer, who's the customer of HUD, we usually talk about just our partners in government and developers and those management companies that are running the buildings and our properties. But under this secretary, under this administration, we're focused on the customers of our customers. And so that means every American that is living on the street every single day or living in hazardous conditions in their homes, making sure that we are preserving the homes that currently exist and making sure that we're getting more housing units into the pipeline in these next 2 years, because we have to be intentional about doing the work now.
So, you mentioned that what the resources that we have now are the most we're ever going to have, and we are hopeful that you're wrong about that there will be massive investments in affordable and supportive housing. The state is doing some, and as you heard, if you listened to the opening preamble from our board chair and interim executive director, we're working hard on building the numbers of supportive housing going forward, just really with New York State resources. But the president has proposed a new plan, housing supply plan. So I'm wondering if the panel can comment on what's in that plan and what that might mean for New York State. Should I start with you, Diane?
Oh, sure. Right, so the president put out, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, the housing supply plan with a goal of expanding or increasing the number of affordable housing units by 1 million in 5 years. The good news of the plan is that it shows that the administration is deeply committed to doing what it can within its power to expand affordable housing throughout the country. The bad news is that there isn't a tremendous amount that the administration has the power to do that can make the level of difference that we need when it comes to affordable housing. So what the administration did was it pulled together all of the rules, the regulations, the administrative changes they can make to existing programs to stretch them as much as they can, to put them to work now. And that's important. But again, the administration on its own has limited reach, because what I think everybody in this room knows is that what's most needed are additional resources, additional investments. We need more money to be able to preserve public housing and other affordable housing, to be able to build homes that are affordable to the lowest income people, to be able to expand housing choice vouchers for the people who need them. And only Congress can do that. So what the administration also does in its plan is to, again, call on Congress to make those transformative investments that passed the U.S. House of Representatives through the Buildback Better Act a reality, and to enact those as soon as possible. And I think we'll talk about those investments in the bill maybe a little bit later, but there are challenges there too. The window of opportunity that was wide open for some time to get these transformative investments through Congress, that window is closing pretty rapidly, and we're running out of time. There is still some time. We are still pushing to get it done, but the timing is much more limited than it was. The one piece that I would pull out of what's in the administrative plan that is within their power, that I think is the most exciting within the plan, relates to local zoning. Again, I think many of you in this room know the restrictions on local zoning that are so often deeply rooted in racism, at least historically, and often still today, that those restrictive local zoning laws inhibit the construction of any kind of apartments, often, and especially affordable apartments. And that creates tremendous difficulties for people, especially down the income ladder, to be able to afford housing. So one of the most important things that has to get done at the local level is for these restrictive local zoning laws to be removed. However, in many communities, local communities don't want to remove those restrictions. They put them there for a reason. They are very tied to them. So, and local zoning, by its name, is a local decision. But there are levers that the federal government can pull. And the biggest one being putting incentives or requirements to change local zoning as a requirement for communities to receive major federal funds. And you might remember back in the fall, Congress did pass an infrastructure spending bill. There was a missed opportunity there. Congress could have put in that bill requirements for local communities to do more on local zoning in order to get those funds. They didn't. But the administration, the Biden administration now is saying, we will. And that could be transformative in and of itself, depending on how far the administration goes with this. So they have said that they are going to judge proposals from local communities for federal funds based in part on what they're going to do to remove or lessen restrictive local zoning. And if they take that sort of to the level that they could, it could have a very big impact on the number of apartments that are built throughout the community. So that's the piece that I find most exciting that they're doing. But again, I think the fact that the Biden administration is taking the time and the effort to put this into a package, to put it forward, is to say to Congress and to the country, affordable housing is a top priority for us. And while Congress lags behind in action, we're going to do all that we can that's within our power to make a difference. And that is promising.
And can I just tap into that real
Yeah.
quick too?
Because it's the ball's in your court, like you said.
So we have this housing supply action plan that was presented by the Biden administration, by the president. And so as an agency, from HUD's perspective, just looking at the plan itself, what can we do as an agency to fulfill this mission and this goal? And another piece of the plan that I think is just so great on HUD's side is the fact that now we are intentional and focused on just looking at HUD properties. And when we have the note sale of our properties, it's usually the big investors that will come out and are able to be the ones to participate in the program and get these like foreclosed properties, whatever is in our portfolio. But we're intentionally focused on making sure that those properties now go to folks that where the properties will be owner occupied or nonprofit organizations. And so I think our first sale was June 8th, I think it's next week. And so this is an opportunity to have that window open and intentionally for nonprofit organizations. And so that's just, HUD doing its part in this space and just being intentional about it with our other federal agencies.
I'm surprised our members aren't running out to line up for that. But that's a great opportunity, and please, if you share with us the details, we'll definitely get it out to our members. Jeff?
I got my 4th COVID shot recently, which means I'm over 50. It means I'm a lot older than I look. When I was born in 1971, this nation had a surplus of affordable housing units, a surplus of 300,000 or so, according to some studies. Right now, we have a deficit of 7 million affordable housing units. This is Diane's work, her team's work that I'm quoting here. The GAP study that the National Low Income Housing Coalition does shows this tremendous gap. It didn't happen by accident. In the first 20 years of my life, federal investment in affordable housing was slashed by 80%. You can track the line of homelessness in the late 70s and early 80s on into the 90s, like this, growing exponentially, with the dramatic cuts in investment in affordable housing. So it's no mystery. It's not an accident that we got to the place that we're at now. Over the last decade, we've seen the slowest home building, the building of new units, new homes, that we've seen since the 1960s. So the production has been down over the last decade, and the administration policies that Alicka and Diane described so beautifully are really trying to accelerate that production. The Biden-Harris administration has actually done a really good job getting more vouchers out on the street. The president's FY22 budget had 25,000 additional housing choice vouchers. The FY23 proposed budget has over 200,000. There's a really significant push on the voucher side. But vouchers are only as good as the number of affordable housing units we have out there and the willingness of landlords to take those vouchers. So people can be walking around with a voucher, and because of racial discrimination, because of discrimination based on criminal background, landlords aren't going to accept people because of discrimination for all kinds of reasons, right? That's true everywhere. That's not just true in New York City and New York State. One other exciting thing that HUD is doing on this front, Secretary Fudge, who chairs our council, she's sort of my board chair right now, and a wonderful advocate for our work to end homelessness. Secretary Fudge ordered all of the HUD program offices to look at all of the barriers that criminal background sets up to people getting and maintaining housing. And they're doing a top-to-bottom analysis of that and hopefully going to be knocking down some of those barriers. That's related to what we're talking about here, but I think another important dimension of it. We've got to build up the pipeline of affordable housing. And I think the president's actions over the last couple of weeks on this lay the foundation for that. But Congress needs to act. As Diane said, without the resources, without the additional funding for affordable housing, we're still trying to crawl out of that hole that we got ourselves in 50 years ago.
One last thing on that.
And then I've got one last thing after that.
But honestly, so I'm leaving here at, I think, 11:35, I think. But it's because I have to rush over to New Jersey where I'm hosting the Jersey City Housing Authority and some congressional members and the mayor, and we're having a roundtable discussion and tour of public housing property. And the purpose of today's discussion is around our newly launched Our Way Home initiative from Secretary Fudge. And it's to make sure that we're pulling down all of the different components of the Housing Supply Action Plan in order to focus directly on cities that are doing great things to house their families, but to spotlight those cities and spotlight those programs and use them as a model for others to see. So we have a National Day of Action today, and so that's the purpose. And it's literally to focus on people that are doing great work and how can we expand it, enhance it, replicate it around the country.
Jeff, back to you if I could, because also at the same time I know you're working diligently on the new plan, the next 5-year plan to end homelessness. And while I'm sure you can't give us all of the details, if you could paint some broad strokes about what you're thinking about and how that plan is going to take shape, and also maybe the timeline for it actually becoming public.
Sure. We are working on a new federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. You've seen these come out over the years. Opening Doors in 2009 was the first one, and there have been subsequent plans. Right now, we've got a full working draft of the thing. It's out to our 19 agencies in the White House for review. We'll be working that through the next few weeks to get our council to approve that plan, and then we're hoping it'll be ready hopefully by September. I don't want to be totally pinned down on that. We've got to jump through some bureaucratic hoops to make it ready for prime time. But I can preview what's coming. So I'll give you a sense of the substance of the plan. There will be a very strong focus on equity, on racial equity, on LGBTQ equity, on preventing discrimination against people with disabilities and all of the other intersectional issues that people face. So that'll be a very strong component of the plan. A lot of times when you're doing strategic planning, people say, where should racial equity go? Is that a value? Is it a principle? Is it something in the vision or mission? Is it a strategy? Is it a bunch of things? It is here, there, and everywhere in our plan. So it is a fundamental value, it's a pillar of the plan, and it is a set of strategies that you implement. So it's not just sort of saying the words, it's actually putting it into action. The second pillar is focused on data and evidence. There's a real attack right now. I want to be really frank about this, and this is a conversation Diane and I have a lot. Housing First is under attack, and it's under attack by people who want to politicize it and make it a partisan issue and say that Housing First is a failed public policy. This is what they say, this is not me. Housing First is a failed public policy because look, we still have homelessness, which is kind of like saying we still have headaches, therefore Advil doesn't work. Or we still have COVID, therefore Paxlovid and vaccines don't work. It's crazy analysis. It doesn't make any sense, but it's what people are saying. The reality is that there are more people coming into homelessness than exiting homelessness. There's a data point from Los Angeles. Every day in Los Angeles, 206 people on average exit homelessness. It's extraordinary, and mostly through Housing First approaches. But 230 become homeless. The math doesn't add up. So we've got to be looking at that data. We've got to be looking at the evidence for what works, and we've got to be doing more of what works, scaling up housing first, scaling up mental health and substance use treatment, scaling up all the stuff that we know to be effective. The third pillar is around collaboration, and Steve, you talked about the state level investments. It is my belief that the federal government has a huge role to play in ending homelessness, but we're not the ones who end it. It ends on the local level with the work that you all do. It ends when city and state and county governments really hold themselves accountable for ending homelessness. So it's got to be collaboration top to bottom, federal, state, local, philanthropy, faith community, business community, nonprofit providers. All of it has to be pointing the same direction. Then there are three parts of the plan that are looking at how and where we intervene. So you can think about this as sort of a continuum where we need to do prevention work, the upstream work of turning off the faucet. We need to do crisis response, addressing the crisis of homelessness right now, people who are dying on the streets of this city, this state, and this nation every night. And then we've got to do the housing and services that really solve homelessness. So that whole continuum, you'll see a lot of strategies within each of those areas in the plan. On the upstream prevention work, think about what it would look like if no young person ever aged out of foster care into homelessness. Think what a lasting impact that would have on those individual lives, but also on the fabric of our society. Imagine if nobody coming out of jail or prison ever ended up on the street or in the subway or in a shelter. Imagine we could figure out a safety net, a set of strategies, the housing and supports at that point of reentry. Imagine we go upstream from eviction, not the point at which somebody's in crisis, but 6 months or a year or 2 years before. What if we had health systems and educational systems screening for housing risk, for homelessness risk, and infusing supports, both financial ones and wraparound services, a year before there's a crisis, 2 years before there's a crisis? We could turn off the faucet. And those become racial equity strategies. 9 out of 10 young people who become homeless, 18 to 24, are people of color. Many identify as LGBTQ. Imagine if we could prevent homelessness at that point. We're also reducing the racial disproportionality of who's experiencing homelessness. We're preventing long-term homelessness among young people. So that's the prevention part. The crisis response part, we're certainly watching what's happening here in New York City around in unsheltered homelessness, around subway sweeps, and around the kind of administration's focus on, how do you both attend to the public health crisis we have of people living outside on grates, living in the subway system, and how do you do that in a humane way that's not just about sweeps? How do you do that in a way that's actually tied to housing? Not to shelter, but to housing. That's what we're trying to push nationally. And obviously there's a resource implication to that. How do you create the pathway from street to housing? Many of you I know do that in your work every day. And then on the housing services side, this is a both and to me. I mean, of course housing is the prescription. That's what's going to end homelessness. But for many people, you do have to have good mental health care. You got to have good substance abuse treatment and access to it. You've got to have good support for people who have experienced the trauma of domestic violence or sexual assault. We've got to provide the services side at the same scale that we're providing the housing side, or the whole thing doesn't hold together. So that's just kind of a preview of what's coming in the plan. Within each of those areas, there are a lot of very specific actions, and we're going to need your help in implementing those.
I think this group is
That's
happy
exciting.
to do that.
I'm excited about that.
Diane, do you want to follow up? Tell us, give us the broadest strokes about what the coalition has been working on. You've been dipping into a number of different streams, including the House campaign, as I said, push for affordable housing and more funding for the National Housing Trust Fund, which is near and dear to our hearts here at the network and something we've been advocating for, and it has shown some very successful results in support of housing, and other initiatives that you're working on as well going forward.
Sure, and just to follow up on Jeff, to say how refreshing and important it is that Jeff and USICH are really stepping back into the space of being very vocal and clear on how we end homelessness in our country. There is backlash, and it's growing. And I know you see it and feel it here in New York City. It's happening across the country, a backlash not only, as homelessness increases and as it becomes increasingly visible in many communities, the backlash against homelessness is also increasing against homeless people, against people who are experiencing homelessness, and against the solutions, the really obvious and much needed solutions to homelessness. So we have a lot of work to do to push back against that false and growing narrative, and USICH and HUD play a really critical role in that, and I'm grateful to have the partnership and the work. At the coalition, we work mostly on the upstream challenges, on the 10 million extremely low-income households who pay at least half of their income towards rent each month. So, when you have such limited income to begin with and you pay half of it at least for your home, you are always one financial shock, whether it's a pandemic or a natural disaster or one of the everyday disasters that come when you live in poverty, like a broken down car or a missed day of work, a sick child. You are always one financial shock away from missing rent, facing eviction, and in worst cases, becoming homeless. So we have to focus on how we make homes more affordable and accessible to those extremely low-income households. And that's really the work that we do at the coalition. Several years ago, about 4 years ago now, we launched the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign. And the idea behind that campaign was that many of us, for many years, some of us for many decades, have been making the case for why we need greater federal investments in homes for the lowest income people. And we've had some success along the way, but really, when you look at the full picture, it's been marginal. And so we realized that we can't keep doing the same thing we've always done with the same partners and expect different results. It can't just be people who care about affordable housing who are asking the federal government for more money for affordable housing. That's not working. So at the same time, we have this growing and really compelling body of research that makes such a strong case for how central housing affordability is in so many other areas of our lives, right? We know that when we're affordably housed, we're healthier, our kids do better in school, we earn more over our lifetimes, we even live longer. And there's data to back up every part of that statement. So we started asking ourselves the question, if leaders in fields outside of housing were as convinced as we are that they are not going to be successful in achieving their goals of better health or increased children's educational attainment, unless and until more people are affordably housed, that they would be willing to join us in our advocacy for greater federal funds. And we asked the question, and the answer was a resounding yes, and the result is the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, which is made up of leaders from sectors like the healthcare sector, the education sector, civil rights, local government, anti-poverty, anti-hunger, all of them joining with us to advance federal policy solutions for affordable housing. Then last year, we launched the Housed campaign, which is for universal, stable, affordable homes. So just as the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign mobilizes people outside of the housing sector, the Housed campaign mobilizes the housing field, impacted people, developers, service and homeless service and shelter providers, advocates at the federal, state, and local level. And the purpose for the Housed campaign was to continue building on the momentum that we had collectively during the pandemic of achieving historic resources. The federal eviction moratorium that was in place, there's never been anything like that in the history of our country in terms of a broad protection to keep renters stably housed, or $46 billion for emergency rental assistance. Unprecedented, 46 times what Congress provided for renters during the Great Recession. So we wanted to build on this historic impact and pivot to the long-term solutions. So OSA and Housed work on parallel tracks toward the same goals, which are universal housing vouchers, as the president committed to during his campaign for president, so we will hold him to that commitment, to expand and preserve affordable housing through preserving public housing, greater supply, building homes affordable to the lowest income people through programs like the National Housing Trust Fund, through rebalancing the power that tilts so heavily in favor of landlords at the expense of renters, through a whole set of robust and permanent tenant protections like just cause evictions, right to counsel, source of income discrimination protections, and to create a permanent program for emergency rental assistance. So these are the solutions that our campaigns work towards. And over the last year, our focus has been on the Buildback Better Act, where we had this really significant input. The president initially proposed $100 billion for housing. We pushed back, said it wasn't enough. He proposed $200 billion for affordable housing. We pushed back, said it wasn't enough. Congress provided $327 billion for transformative affordable housing investments in the first iteration of Build Back Better. That got winnowed down to $150 billion, with 3/4 of it targeted for investments for the lowest income people that could truly end homelessness in our country. So unfortunately, you all know how this story ends, which is that the bill got stuck and is still stuck in the Senate. But negotiations on a new reconciliation package have picked back up. This has happened a few times over the last 6 months, so I'm not going to pretend I know how this is going to turn out. But it is our last best chance in the near future to get the level of investments that we need. So we have to make every effort we can to get these housing investments included in any reconciliation bill that moves forward. And your senator, Senator Schumer, is one of literally a handful of people that are negotiating this bill. So please stay in front of him and his staff, continuing to insist that any reconciliation package that moves forward includes these housing investments. If, or if not, this moment passes, we also have to look ahead to next year and the likelihood, or the possibility, I think the likelihood, that control of the House and maybe the Senate are going to flip, and we are going to be back to both defending the programs that we know work and looking for bipartisan solutions that we can move forward. And there too, we have several bills, bipartisan bills, that will work to push forward, which won't have the same transformative impact that these investments would, but together can make a real difference in our efforts to address and end homelessness.
So much to talk about. Somebody raised a hand. I think it's 10 after. One more question from your friendly neighborhood moderator, then I'll throw it to the audience, particularly for some questions for Alicka before she goes running out of here. If there are any particular that you want to address to her, maybe come up to the mic and you can prepare yourself. But I would ask the panel to comment on something that Diane, you alluded to a little bit in the House campaign, but has really set a fire in our imaginations, and that's universal rental assistance. Can you talk about how that idea is starting to percolate? And this is to the whole panel, and you know, where we might go with that ultimately.
Well,
By next week.
so when we talk about like universal vouchers and everything else, for me, it's just difficult to live in a space of like a dream world. And I say that because I have to live in reality. I've been a black woman for almost 50 years now. And, you know, just growing up in public housing, my mother was always a paycheck away from homelessness. And so it's difficult to wish upon a star when you have to live in a reality. And so it's you know, we need to have these conversations and keep pushing them forward. But when I opened up, I said that the money and the resources that are on the table now, we need to be focused on it and using it now, because in the event that it does flip, we won't have access to this. And if we don't use it, we will lose it. And so I was one of those individuals as a member of the council who stood at press conferences with our amazing, fearless Chuck Schumer with signs that said, "Buildback Better Now," right? And I led that. And had all of my public housing residents believing that there was no need for us to push for more funding on one end and talk about the preservation of housing with the conversions from Section 9 to Section 8, because we had $100 billion that was going to come to New York, $80 billion was going to come to New York and save the day. And that didn't happen. And so, we had to have these real life tough conversations around what can we do now with the resources that are available now to make sure that our families are being housed. And so I just wanted to touch on that part about the universal vouchers and stuff, because even with the vouchers, there's still a shortage of housing units. And so what are we doing to preserve what we have now? In so many communities, you see developers building shelters because they know that they can build as of right, and it's not permanent. Affordable housing is built with the sole intention of turning into shelters so they could get more money from the system, because that's what's out there. But what are we doing to make sure that we stop with the zonings, change the zonings, and provide incentives for communities to be able to look at what's available now, what's vacant now, and utilize that. And one other thing, the part of the Buildback Better that did go through with the infrastructure bills, looking to see how can we leverage those dollars with transportation and Main Street grants and everything else to be able to still put more housing units in the pipeline with those types of funding streams.
So I couldn't agree more that states and cities have to do everything they can every day with the resources that are available. And because of major bills that passed during the pandemic, many states and cities have more resources than they've had in decades. There are many cities across the country that have massive surpluses right now, and they should be using significant portions of that to address homelessness and housing affordability issues for the lowest income people, without a doubt. And as we have known for decades, the scale of the challenges that communities across the country face when it comes to homelessness and housing affordability requires a federal response. It requires a federal intervention. And states and cities cannot, on their own, end homelessness and end housing poverty, as we can do as a country if the federal government invests at the scale necessary. So we are closer to the possibility of universal housing vouchers than we have ever been as a country. And that didn't happen by accident. That happened through decades of organizing and advocacy and pushing policymakers at all levels to recognize that housing vouchers, while not a silver bullet solution, are proven successful at addressing and ending homelessness and housing poverty in many cases and in many communities. So we have right now an administration that, unlike any in the past, talks about housing as a human right. Approaching affordable housing within that frame makes a tremendous difference when you start talking about what are the solutions to realize housing as a human right. And we can look back over in recent decades, whether Republican or Democratic presidents have not before said housing is a human right. Similarly, we have a president who on the campaign trail committed to achieving universal housing vouchers. Again, that's unprecedented, and that happened through the work that many of us have been doing for years. Can we achieve it in his administration, in his first term, or in a second term if there is one? It's very hard to say, but we can make steps towards it, and we already are. So as Jeff said in the last appropriations bill, there's an increase in vouchers. It's a significant increase. It's a bigger increase in new incremental vouchers than we've seen in years. And the president is proposing 200,000 new incremental vouchers this year. Build Back Better is its own fight. Appropriations is a place, and especially in this year, while the Democrats have the majority and are prioritizing affordable housing, where we can make a real difference in expanding the number of incremental vouchers that exist. For the last 10 years, we've been under these very tight, completely arbitrary budget caps under the Budget Control Act. That is no longer a factor. So appropriators have decisions to make, and they can make ones that could make a huge difference in the lives of people experiencing homelessness today. So yes, are we going to achieve universal housing vouchers in the next 2 to 4 years? Probably not. But should we continue to hold that out as our North Star so that we can keep making progress and steps towards that? Absolutely. And we're closer than we've ever been as a country to actually achieving it. So we need to keep going.
I think I'd like to just kind of cap this part of the conversation by zooming back out a little bit. Think about, my heart is broken over the little kids who were shot in Uvalde, Texas a few days ago, and another shooting in Tulsa yesterday. When I think about those little kids, the fourth graders there, the first graders at Sandy Hook a decade ago, we don't treat education as a scarce commodity that only certain people get. We used to, as a nation. If you look at the first 50 or 75 years of this nation's history, once it became an independent country in the late 1700s, education was not a human right. We didn't treat it that way. Only rich people could send their kids to school. The public school movement took speed in the 1840s and 1850s, and throughout that century and since, we have treated kindergarten through 12th grade, essentially, as a basic right. Everybody gets that. It's not always been equal. I grew up in Alabama in the 70s and 80s. It was certainly not equal. Separate was never equal. But we made a decision a long time ago as a country that everybody gets to go to school. And we pay for that. It's a screwed up way we pay for it. That's another workshop. We've never done that with housing. We have never said, let's scale the housing to meet the need rather than ration these precious housing slots and decide who gets them and who doesn't, which is crazy to me because even more than education, housing is a thing that keeps people alive. It is, that Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, it is on the fat bottom part of that pyramid with food and clothing. You need it to stay alive. But yet we've never operationalized housing as a human right. Secretary Fudge is the first HUD secretary I can recall ever uttering the words, housing is a human right. That is language we're including in our federal strategic plan to end homelessness. How you live up to that is the hard part. And that is the part that may take us quite a long time to get there. And you get smart about the incremental gains that we can do in the short term, but you keep your sights on the horizon, which is that we can do with housing what we did with education. We can make it available for all as a basic part of being a human being in this society. So I hold out hope that we can get there. It's the short-term navigating that's the real challenging part. But if we can keep our sights on that long view, then I think we can figure out the tactics to how to get there. It just may take us some more years ahead.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So I want to open it up for questions. The mic is up front. We have mics to use to be safe. Bonus points for tough questions for Alicka, front-loaded, but the gentleman in green shirt, you raised your hand, so.
Yeah, I have a voice I'm curious, so I'll just try to
All
be loud here. I'm not sure about the whole mic thing. Is there like a resource handout or something like that that's going to be provided to us where we would be able to find some of these initiatives and strategies and further research on our own to provide to our agencies that are in like suburban or rural areas that some of the stuff may be kind of underutilized?
I'm not sure what they're going to provide after this session, but I know that I can leave my information here because it's part of my job to go out and talk to communities, talk to organizations, have roundtable discussions, do tours to find out the work that you're doing and even to provide technical assistance from HUD. And so it's something that we're intentional about doing.
I would also encourage you, if you haven't, to go to our website, which is nlihc.org. Those are the initials for National Low Income Housing Coalition, where we include information on all of the campaigns, the federal policy work that we do, but you can also sign up for our weekly newsletter, which includes information from what's happening in Congress, at HUD, other federal agencies, and at the state and local level related to furthering towards our mission and our goals.
And I'm going to give the same plug for our website and newsletter too. Click on ours before you click on Diane's. We don't have the most elegant acronym, but it's usich.gov. And subscribe to the email list. Anytime federal funding opportunities come out, we amplify those. When we release a new resource, we share that. When the federal strategic plan comes out, we'll be doing webinars and other things, so you can find out about it on our list. You mentioned rural areas also, and I know a lot of you are from upstate and around the state. HUD is about to release a funding opportunity around unsheltered homelessness that will focus certainly on large cities and big unsheltered homelessness, but there's also a rural set-aside in that, and that's going to be coming out pretty quickly. So keep your eyes open for that, and look for the rural part if you all live in rural parts of the state.
And Sam Miller is here in the front row. He's out of our 26 Federal Plaza Regional Office, and so he has business cards with him. So as I make a mad dash out, Sam will still be around.
I also want to mention that we have regional coordinators assigned to every state in the country, and for New York, as of right now, Bev Eversold, and you can find her on our website, is the Region 1 regional coordinator. We're about to hire a new one, so that role may shift, but you can find that on our website as well. That person can be a great resource to you all and kind of your link to our agency.
Ditto from us, too. We have a website. Some links to their websites. And we work really closely, particularly with the coalition, also with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, around issues, and have a semi-robust advocacy arm of our organization that focuses on both federal, state, and local New York City advocacy work that all overlaps and interweaves with what we're talking about here. So happy to have you join us in those efforts as we work through the final stages of this Congress and looking towards next Congress. Let's see, Nancy, you want to go?
Yeah, can I stand in? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think we'll be ready.
Yeah, more an observation and then maybe a suggestion, but our community, upstate New York, we're leading community groups on how to spend the home ARP money. And resoundingly in surveys, we all recognize affordable housing is the key. However, when it came to community decision-making, how to spend the money, the bang for the buck, the community decided to put it into rent assistance and prevention because the number of units that could have been built seemed cost prohibitive. So I find that we recognize affordable housing units is key, the lack of them, but when folks are making an analysis of the big bang for the buck, it feels like we're forcing ourselves into serving more people versus long-term investment. So I would also say I'm wondering down the road if we could find ways to build more affordable housing within affordable housing. I know the price per unit to build housing, we just built some, luckily with HHAP, we're grateful to the state. It's expensive to build these units. And I don't have a solution for it other than I know sometimes there's all these creative ideas on how to house folks other than the traditional bricks and mortar that, maybe that's something we could explore and address through zoning to serve more people with a limited pot.
I think it's such a good point. I came in last night from DC and looking out my hotel room, staying upstairs here, looking across at an empty office building, right? I mean, and Midtown Manhattan's not the only place where we see this. When you walk down the street of Los Angeles or Seattle or Houston or New York and see people living outside and see empty spaces of any kind, it's a travesty, right? We need to be thinking much more creatively about the range of housing options, so it's not just one person per one bedroom unit, but we're really more creatively about how to convert government-owned buildings, how to convert commercial spaces. How, you know, I know there's a cost to all of that too, but I just think we need to kind of blow the doors off of our thinking in terms of how we match up the human beings who need a roof over their head with the buildings that are sitting empty right now.
And that's another part of the housing supply action plan as well, that they're talking about different like studies and research related to like in rural counties and different areas. How do you finance different types of housing structure, looking at the possibility for accessory dwelling units, and looking at the opportunity to, when you actually get a mortgage loan, you will be able to possibly get the same type of financing to do construction and then have that lumped into your mortgage loan period from construction to permanent loan. And so that's part of the conversation that's coming out of the housing supply action plans.
Yeah, and it's some of the money that is available at the local level. As you said, the home American Rescue Plan dollars, they were initially envisioned to be used for that purpose, because conversion, rehab, of course, is always far less expensive than new construction. And those funds were made available for those communities that had used FEMA resources to move people who were experiencing homelessness to safety during the pandemic into hotels or motels, to now have the funds to purchase some of those hotels or motels and convert them into affordable housing, into some single room occupancy housing, which is a big missing piece in a lot of our housing stock. So it doesn't make your work easier at the local level, I recognize that, but to lift up those communities that have been able to use some of these resources for conversion, to share some of the data about how it is less expensive but still creates that long-term housing stock in the community, might be helpful to some of your efforts.
Hi, Steve. I'm going to talk about air conditioning because my allergies. But I went to the YWCA in Rochester, and we do affordable housing, and we have permanent housing, HUD contracts, and all of that kind of stuff. But I was just having a conversation the other day with staff, and you know, some of our staff are becoming homeless because we haven't gotten increases. And I don't know if you're the panel to talk about this, but you know, I'm sure people here can relate living paycheck to paycheck, trying to, you know, one paycheck away from homelessness. When our grants, you know, we've had a HUD contract for 7 years, and we get the fair market rent in our subsidies, but the salary line doesn't go up. So we're trying to get staff to be able to, you know, afford their bills, but yet they're struggling and trying to help other people. It's just, it's a difficult situation right now, especially with, you know, gas prices, food prices, you know, bread prices are going up, people can't afford housing. I mean, most of our staff are renters. You can't even afford a house right now. So I don't know if you're the right people or you know the right people, but we have federal, state, city, like I said, HUD contracts that are plateaued, and they continue to be that way for years and years and years. And I know Shitty has worked very hard with NISHIP, and we just got a little bit of relief, but some of them stay very flat, and staff struggle. So I just want to put a plug in there.
Yeah.
They were protesting in front of New York City Hall this week about the increase in salaries. So that's happening. And I think I read somewhere recently that there's no state in the entire country, no city where individuals can afford a 2-bedroom with the minimum wage. There's just not one state in this country.
Where she read that.
That's also
I'm
NLIC
joking, I know.
research. Yes, and our new edition of Out of Reach is coming out at the end of July, and unfortunately, things have not improved, as you all can imagine.
I think the wage question is a real one. I mean, we were already seeing 50% turnover rates in the homelessness workforce prior to COVID. That was prior to the Great Resignation. It was prior to the inflation we've seen in housing costs, where wages certainly aren't keeping up in the last year anywhere in the country. I think this is a place that philanthropy can step in. I know philanthropy's already stretched in a lot of different directions, but you could think about how to creatively maybe match some private dollars with public dollars to figure out the salary that you need to have to keep people. There's also, coming out from the CDC, some public health workforce dollars to the tune of I think $2 billion or so. And we're looking at whether, agencies that are doing homelessness and housing work might be able to tap into some of that money. I don't know all of the details of that funding opportunity, but it'd be worth looking at the CDC's healthcare workforce efforts just to see if there's a way that your agencies or communities might be able to tap into some consortium that could go after some of that.
So you had a question? No, you raised your hand.
Okay, that's me.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that that's like just such a wonderful point, and so courageous for you to have mentioned. And I just think, yeah, I believe that like 4.4 million New Yorkers last year were on Medicaid, on public health plan. That's half of the city's population. So what if like half of the city's population would need a universal housing voucher if that ever became available? Like, what does that really say? I mean, it just seems like it's a bigger issue than just, the need for more supportive housing units. Like, there's something, I mean, you mentioned, that housing should be a human right, like public education. Public education was supposed to help up the country so that we could have a productive society that could afford housing. So what is happening? That, I mean, obviously that's a bigger question, but that, so many people are being failed in this country,
And you know what's interesting? So that's another piece of the work that we do and what our secretary has been pushing for HUD is housing and urban development, right? So we're not just focused on the housing piece of it, but also the community development piece of the work. And community development also talking about economic development and how are we supporting our residents, how are we supporting the community as a whole. And I had an interesting conversation yesterday with Audible in Newark, New Jersey, where that company is there, but they're providing $500 stipends to their employees as an incentive to be there and working with other small businesses to encourage them to come into the Newark community so that they can all work to build and be able to hire the residents that live there, and so that they'll be able to increase their salaries and also be able to afford this new Newark, or we see this happening all around the country. And so it's not just a focus on housing, but also how we're supporting the individuals there. And it's education, it's employment opportunities. And so Section 3 and workforce development is a huge piece of our focus at HUD.
Well, and the equation that you just described is sort of the cost of housing and the money that people have, right? Income or whatever financial means they have, those don't match up right now. So the Out of Reach report shows this, what it would actually take for a person working an hourly job to afford a 2-bedroom apartment or a 1-bedroom apartment. They don't match up right now. They're way out of whack. One thing that's really cool, though, is that a lot of communities are moving towards direct cash transfers. I don't know if you've heard that term, or universal basic income, where there are some small-scale pilots that are looking at putting cash in people's pockets to be able to start closing that gap some. And there's some exciting work going on even here in New York City with youth experiencing homelessness around direct cash transfers that at least begin building up the income side of that equation. Chapin Hall out of the University of Chicago and Point Source Youth here in New York are partnering on those kinds of pilots in San Francisco, Boston, New York City, and a few other places. And there's kind of research being done on that right now. It's not scaled up to meet the need, certainly, but it's a really promising, I think, direction to kind of say, this is not just about getting somebody a case manager. It's about making sure they have enough money to pay the rent, enough money to put food on the table, enough money to take care of their kids. And there is really good research beginning to emerge on this. There was a study out of London 10 years ago with what they call rough sleepers. These would be like chronically homeless folks in London. And they basically gave these individuals a couple $1,000s in cash every month and found incredibly good results around sobriety, around work, around housing stability, all kinds of stuff. So much so that one of the findings was and we should get rid of the social worker we hired to administer the program and just put that cash in people's pockets. Like, it was really, really working. So I think this is a direction to pay attention to. It would also be hard to scale. The cost is going to be hard for some folks to swallow, but it's a really, really good approach.
Lorraine?
Hi, I'm a big believer in free market, and so I read an article in the, I think it was the Washington Post back in 2019, that stated that economists had found a unseen force that was hampering affordable housing, and they alluded to affordability. And so I wanted to know, is there anything in the administration's plan that you have made of that, of kind of penalizing oligopolies if they kind of corner the housing market, affordable housing market in any way like that? It just, it's similar to how they would penalize, let's say, a bank to use regular stock market or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's a deep and complicated question that you ask. I think, there are certainly some things in our federal strategic plan that are trying to tie fair housing enforcement. This is not exactly the question you're asking, but making sure that landlords aren't discriminating against people for a variety of reasons, from racial identity to sexual orientation or gender identity to disability to criminal history. So that's one place where I think we can have some teeth as the administration, is better identification of discrimination and enforcement against landlords who are doing that. Now, I tie that to your question about the kind of the larger landlords are the ones who are often the most frequent offenders around evictions, around mistreatment of people, and that kind of thing. So I think there's some work we can do on those fronts. I think the bigger question of the free market forces at play in housing is a really, really hard one, and a political third rail for a lot of people.
Well, and also to say that the private market certainly has a critical role to play in the housing ecosystem. But the private market on its own cannot build and operate homes that are affordable to the lowest income people, because the amount of rent that an extremely low income household can pay doesn't cover the costs to develop and operate that home. That's a basic market failure and requires government intervention in the form of subsidies to rectify. So the private market is important, but it's also very important to understand that no matter how much regulation you reduce, no matter how much reform you increase in particular programs, the private market cannot and will not maintain and operate homes affordable for the lowest income people.
A little piece of the answer was contained in what Alicka said earlier about the HUD providing fast track for nonprofits and for individual home ownership for properties that they have in receivership. And that, it's incremental, but certainly it's a resource in a highly charged environment here. It's a lot. We know from past experience that for-profit developers gobbled up everything, even single-family homes, and just converted them to rental housing, which and then started to boost the rents beyond what our supportive housing, affordable housing tenants can afford. So that's, I think, another step in the right direction. Yes, you've been patient. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering if either of you know much about or what you think of community land trusts and how that can help.
I think it's a part of the puzzle. It's a piece of the puzzle of solutions needed. I think having community ownership of land increases the housing stability of the people who live there. It reduces the likelihood of these exorbitant rent hikes that we see in the private market. I think it's an important part of the solution. On its own, clearly, it's not enough. There's much more that's needed.
And I would echo that. I mean, a couple of examples that I've seen of land trusts work very, very well. I was living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and doing street outreach when this old sawmill area was redeveloped right near downtown as a land trust. That was 25 years ago, and it's still going strong and doing well. Alicka, I think in her introduction, said she used to work at Common Ground. Common Ground, now Community Solutions, is doing a land trust in East Hartford, Connecticut. I think it's, as Diane said, a really good tool to have in our toolkit as one of many. And you mentioned SROs earlier. Single room occupancies, particularly after the Great Depression, were critical in ending homelessness in those days, yet we've essentially phased them out. These are kind of, one room efficiency, kind of studio-ish places, very small, but we need to get back to that kind of thinking where we're looking at all options possible. New development, conversions of commercial space in public buildings, development of SROs, conversions of motels and hotels, land trusts, vouchers to private landlords, the whole range of things. It's not just about, we got kind of in the universal voucher conversation a little while ago. I'm not sure that works fully because you've still got to have the adequate supply to make that work. So I think we need a wide range of options, and I'd love to see more land trusts as part of that.
Fun fact, the Supportive Housing Network of New York was started 30-some odd years ago as the SRO providers group to address what Jeff was just talking about, the gentrification around SROs back in the 80s that led to a big loss of affordable housing for people who were in the bottom portion of the income level and for homeless people in particular. Let's see, this question over here somewhere. Carol?
Where to start? Thank you, Supportive Housing Network, for this conference and this amazing panel and the work that you're doing and the chorus that is all here in the room today. I can't be the only one who is aware of the plethora of unbelievably, I don't want to call them stupid, but certainly not based in reality, who are occupying the offices of Capitol Hill. It seems to me that that's where our problem is right now. They won't give an inch, and we've all been there. I know I've been with Steve down talking to elected officials. Maybe this is now the pivotal moment for us to figure out why it is we keep putting these idiots back in office, and they're out there today saying the most egregious things. Are we not outraged and ready to storm the Bastille? Let's bring all of the people that we take care of every day and bring them to their offices, because those are the folks who have no grounding in reality. They don't know what it. When was the last time a person elected to Congress was homeless and had to do without something, or couldn't, pay their mortgage or their health care or insurance? They have no clue. So maybe we consider storming the Bastille.
Just be a little careful about the metaphor. I'll say a couple things in response to that, Carol. I appreciate your comments and the passion. Homelessness was not always such a partisan issue as it is now. There is no reason it should be. This is something I believe we could find common ground across the political spectrum on. I don't understand why we can't. So I remain committed to that and hopeful about it. Your broader point about bringing people who have experienced homelessness into positions of power, as you were talking, I thought about Cori Bush from Missouri, who has herself experienced homelessness not that long ago, and she is an elected official. But there are also a ton of millionaires up there on Capitol Hill. And I think getting people in the room with real folks who are experiencing these crises every day is critical. I keep coming back to our federal plan because that's a lever we have to move things. There is a lot of commitment in our plan to create bigger tables and better power sharing with people with lived experience of homelessness. We're already paying people with lived experience to serve as expert consultants with us on a variety of things, including development of the plan, which was informed by the input of more than 500 people who have experienced homelessness and many others who have not, but who are providers. So I think at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level, we all need to do a better job of getting the right people in the right rooms. Because you can't have rooms full of people who have never experienced homelessness making decisions on behalf of people who have. That's not okay.
I just want to say yes to all of it. Yes, Carol, yes. Yes. And yes, Jeff. And that, just to name another challenge that we face, is even among those members of Congress who do get it, who care deeply, who prioritize affordable housing, when it comes down to a choice, you know, here's, okay, there's your 10 top priorities and housing is among them. What are your top 3 priorities? For too many members of Congress, including our strongest allies, affordable housing is not in that top 3. And we are seeing it even now with, as Buildback Better gets winnowed down and winnowed down and winnowed down, and you see some of the greatest champions for affordable housing saying, if I had to choose, I would choose the child tax credit. And their child tax credit benefits greatly many of the same people that we all care deeply about. But we still have a ways to go to get those champions to say affordable housing is the top priority, and here's all the reasons why. And we still have work to do.
Hi, Emily Kurtz, Rise Road Community Partnership. This is going to seem like a very narrow question in comparison to the very broad topics we've been talking about, which are fascinating. But going back to like user experience, there, as we have our tenants and our clients, the process of actually getting the affordable housing that is available becomes very difficult. It is a full day's work to gather all the paperwork on an annual basis to prove that you're poor enough to live in the housing. And when we talk about that with the folks that are asking us for this paperwork, the answer is always like, oh, well, you know, it's the federal government. It's the federal government. So I'm just curious, like in your work, if there are conversations with the IRS to talk about the requirements that our investors require us to force on our tenants. How do we navigate that, and how can, as a group, we impact that part of the user experience? And I think it's a similar question. We've always pegged affordability at 30%. It's a federal number, I guess. But is there a way to think about what it's actually like to pay 30% of your rent when you're very poor? And that's also more of like a national, federal government question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very pragmatic question you ask, and I would throw into the mix on that, and we make people answer the same questions 10 times for all kinds of different programs depending on what their funding stream is. So,
and the government has the information.
and the government has the information, probably at the local level and at least in aggregate at the national level. I mentioned earlier that our council is made up of 19 federal agencies. We're trying to both collaborate with and coordinate and wrangle 19 federal agencies. But we do have access to conversations with the Social Security Administration, with the IRS, with HUD, certainly on its kind of how public and Indian housing requires certain information for public housing authorities and that sort of thing. A lot of these decisions can be made at the local level about how you might streamline. Some certainly have to be made at the federal level. I've been in the job 3 months. We haven't solved this one yet, but it's on our radar screen. I mean, I'm talking routinely with our policy team about how we can streamline some of these ways that either there's already information out there around proof of income is a really good example. If people are filing their taxes, which not everybody does, but if they are, the federal government has this information, and yet there's a kind of brick wall between there and the housing side of things, or even the healthcare side of things. So it's on our radar screen to get into conversation about. I can't guarantee that we'll be able to resolve it immediately, but it's certainly something that we hear about from providers and from people experiencing homelessness as well.
And we learned a lot through emergency rental assistance programs during the pandemic, where we didn't have really the proof point in housing that simplifying applications, simplifying eligibility requirements, using self-attestation for eligibility, using proxies for eligibility. We didn't have that proof point in housing before. We do now. The proxies piece is a really important one, where with many emergency rental assistants, and this was guidance that came from the White House, was to say if you have an applicant from a community that the majority are below the poverty line, or the majority are people of color, or the majority are extremely low income, you can make a safe assumption that that person is affordable for your program, and you can use these proxies for affordability. There are a number of ERA programs that used that to good effect, same with the self-attestation. So I think now our job is to take those learnings and that proof and start to apply it more broadly to other federal programs, and to look for other creative ways to get help to people, whether it's universal basic income or in housing. What if, rather than Section 8 housing choice vouchers, we had a renter's tax credit? And it was a hidden subsidy so that landlords couldn't discriminate or not against whether their tenant was receiving this federal subsidy. And the simplification for eligibility was significant. So these are the kind of creative ideas I think we have to take forward.
Gentlemen, I'd say green or gray, yes.
No way. Let's not beat around the bush, but the main focus for people in Congress is to get as much money as possible for fundraising. But the other one is, it only costs $20 billion to end homelessness. How does maybe it was $20 billion? And I agree with the woman that just left, and it was like, how do we get these Congress people, these people in Congress to get off their butts and actually pass that money? And I agree. I agree storing the best deal. How about sending all the homeless into the homes, and they'll not leave until they get what they want. That's it.
So I'll take a slightly different, we've touched, I think, on this in a lot of ways. One, to say it would cost more than $20 billion to end homelessness, and we shouldn't sell ourselves short. And I think one of the real advancements we've made, both as a movement and with our allies in Congress, is to ask for what we need. And it's far more than that to actually end homelessness and make sure more people don't become homeless soon thereafter. But just another piece of work that we do that I think is really foundational to our long-term success is around voter engagement of low-income people, people experiencing homelessness, and their allies. When you look at, I would love to show a chart right now that makes it so clear. We ask ourselves so often, what's it going to take for members of Congress to truly prioritize the needs of low-income renters? And when you look at the disparities between who registers and who votes, it's very clear what it's going to take. Higher income homeowners vote at much higher rates than lower income renters. And there are many reasons for that, including outright voter suppression tactics. But until policymakers see voters and their allies as a powerful voting bloc, that's when we're going to see the level of change that we really need. Yes, money, but also votes. They want to keep their jobs. And so once they start to see their constituents and the number of renters that are registered and show up to vote on election day, that's when they start to take those concerns more seriously and prioritize them.
Boy, we have time for one more question, I think, but that almost is the perfect ending, Diane. So, gentlemen in the far back, and then we'll send you guys off.
So I just wanted to basically touch on a lot of things. The universal housing voucher definitely will be transformative. My main thing is for most random ordinary voters that would run into, their pushback would be, great, isn't that what Section 8 is? But most people who don't have that experience
Well, yeah, I think, landlord groups are a good example, and they do support, generally, the industry groups for landlords, to the extent that there are some, support expanded housing vouchers for obvious reasons, and they sometimes have different allies in Congress than we do. So that's a partnership that we work to build. One of the things about affordable housing is that there's a way to make an argument for it from pretty much any perspective you come from. And you have to know who your audience is and who you're trying to convince. In the housing field, in the housing movement, we've convinced, I think, when we use the moral argument, which is incredibly powerful and true, I think we've convinced pretty much everybody we're going to with that argument. So we should also look to make the case and use the data and research that's available to us for how affordable housing lowers costs to the federal government through Medicaid. When people are affordably housed, Medicaid costs fall by 12%. So if you're talking to somebody who cares about costs to the federal government, there's an argument. When you talk to people who care about educational attainment for kids, there's an argument. It comes back to the campaign that we developed, and part of its success is that I can go into a member of Congress's office. They might not care at all about affordable housing, and I'm not going to convince them that they should. But if one of our partners, they do care about something that one of our partners care about. They care about education or health care or local economies or tax rates. And having a partner who's able to meet them where they are and help them see the path back to the need for greater affordable housing investments can also be really powerful.
And to the first part of your comment of the general public thinking you need housing, you go down to the office and get housing, they don't know about the 10-year wait lists at public housing authorities. They don't know the tens of thousands of people that are waiting. We don't do that with Medicare. You get Medicare because you reach a certain age. We don't do that with Social Security. You don't get on a waiting list, and when a slot opens up, you get that slot. You hit a certain age and you get it. These are universal guarantees. They're entitlements. We've not ever made that decision about housing, but we could. As a society, we could decide, just like in 1936, when the Social Security Administration was put into place, we could decide it's not okay for anyone over 65 to be broke and to be homeless and to be without health care. We decided that a long time ago, in the 30s and in the 60s. We could decide the same thing about housing if we wanted to.